I'm gonna be honest with my opinion about Vex. I don't think Vex is as good as she should be against dashing characters. I legit think Vex should like just make Yasuo and characters like him absolutely miserable, and I don't know if that actually happens. Vex's entire kit is countered by Wind Wall. So yeah, Wind Wall counters Vex, and I think that's just something that you're not gonna really get around. But like even outside of Wind Wall, if you look at like Vex's like mid lane win rates and you like compare it and you look at the characters she's fighting against who are like almost all dashers, like I would just expect her to be significantly more powerful. This is like a personal opinion. It's not necessarily shared by everybody, but like an example of what I'm getting at is imagine you have a character who only plays against dashers. I'm like speaking a little hyperbolically to illustrate a point. Imagine you have a character that counters dashers and only plays against dashers. If that character was good at their job, I would expect their win rate to be very, very, very high. Because they're playing against the people they counter, right? And so in a world where Vex's win rate is like 50%, to me that feels like she's a weak champion given how many dashing champions she tends to play against. It's kind of like one of the potential pitfalls around balancing around win rate is if the meta is one thing and a character counters the meta, you end up nerfing the characters who counter the meta, which then reinforces the meta. This happened years ago with Annie, actually, before her rework. There was a meta where I think it was like, I don't know, it was like assassins like Yasuo in mid lane or something like that. Assassins and Yasuo and stuff. It was like a very like, I think it was a very melee-centric mid lane meta. And it just so happened that at the time, Annie was very good against these melee characters because she'd harass them from range. And so at the time, Annie was very, very good against these mid lane characters. And she basically countered the meta. And so we nerfed her because her win rate was high. And then a few months later, we actually went back on the nerfs because we were like, oh, wait, it wasn't that Annie was super OP. It's that she was just countering the actual OP stuff. And at the time, by nerfing her, we had essentially reinforced the current OP characters in the meta. And so, like, I think that's, like, a challenge. Although I say all this and like I'm probably about to eat my words and like Vex is like maybe like one of the highest win rate mid laners in the game right now. Let's go find out. Yeah, she's probably actually pretty good right now, honestly. Her win rate's pretty high. I think I was talking about a Vex like in past patches. Like I saw a lot of patches where Vex would like sit around 50, 51. Like she'd have the same win rate as Sylas and stuff, and it'd be like, I don't know if that's correct for her. But right now she actually probably does look pretty decently strong compared to sometimes in the past. So I'm probably dumb about her actual power level at the moment. Vex is probably pretty good right now. Do I think AMBESSA will be pro-jailed since she looks like she has an insane skill ceiling? So I'm not going to say yes or no because I legitimately don't know. I think a thing to think about with AMBESSA though is one of the reasons certain characters that get pro-jailed that have skill ceilings is not just because they're hard to play, but also because what they do with their skill ceiling. So as an example, Riven has a pretty large skill ceiling, but it doesn't really matter. Because getting really, really good at Riven doesn't get you, like, reliable, powerful things that pros value. Comparatively, K'Sante was a character who, he had an insane skill ceiling, and getting really, really good at him gave you a mobile, lane reliable, safe tank, which is something pros highly, highly, highly value. And so one thing we're thinking about with AMBESSA is, will she have a high skill ceiling? Yes. That it will make it, that is definitely always going to be a balanced challenge to some degree. And she's got target access like that, right? So like that's definitely something to consider as well. But then she's also like, doesn't have the best in-lane crowd control, doesn't have the best reliable safety in lane, things like that. And whether or not that'll like even out so that she's not as good in pro, I don't know. But it's just kind of a note that having a skill ceiling can make you a pro pick champ, but it's not necessarily guaranteed depending on what that skill ceiling gets you as a champion. And pros tend to value reliability, they tend to value CC, They tend to value characters who have like a lot of safety, meaning that if they go in, they don't just die, things like that. And so it's like you don't really see characters like Riven or Zed in pro play nowadays, or Katarina, even though they have like insane skill ceilings. Akshan's another one. Akshan's very, very skill intensive, but like being good at Akshan doesn't get you things that pro players would necessarily value. And so again, I'm not saying she's not going to be a pro problem. I'm not saying she is going to be a pro problem. I don't know. I'm not working right now. I haven't been thinking about her. But just trying to give you a thought that like there's a lot that goes into determining if a character is a pro problem. And one of the big ones is if your skill ceiling turns you into something that very reliably does something pros value. Do you feel like a lot of the champions released to mid had to go bot because they couldn't fight the Dashi champs? I think some of them that was the case, but I also just think some of them just don't feel as good mid anymore, partially because of some of the Dashi champs. But it's just like Morgana to this day is viable mid. Like you play Morgana mid, you'll win a lot of games. It's just people don't want to play her mid because it's not really enjoyable to play her there. And so I think we have this challenge with a number of mid lane mages. Some of the mid lane mages just don't feel like they're powerful mid, and we can't buff them to be powerful mid because we have to balance them around bot lane and 50%, like 51% win rates. So that's part of it. Like I guarantee you, if Lux was balanced to like have a 53% win rate mid, you'd see a lot more Lux. If Xerath and Vel'Koz could have 53 or 54% win rates mid, something they used to have, you'd probably see a lot more of them there. But like, you know, when they're balanced around 51, 52, they don't feel nearly as powerful there, especially against the Dashi champs. So that's probably part of it. Another part of it though is there's certain characters that like, yes, we intended them to go mid, but like their fantasy just doesn't fit what mid lane players want. It's kind of like how if we make a champion that goes bot and it's not an AD carry, it probably would be less popular bot because most bot lane players want to play an AD carry. So as an example with Seraphine, most mid lane players don't want to play a supportive mage. Now, most support players, on the other hand, do. And so I think one of the things about Seraphine is she was a bit of a mismatch between, like, Seraphine was a bit of a mismatch between, like, player fantasy and role. It just turns out that most of the people who look at Seraphine and be like, that's a champion for me, tend to be support mains, whereas the mid lane players aren't necessarily as interested in that type of character in their lane, even if it's viable there. Was she intended to go mid? Yes, Seraphine was intended to go mid. We wanted to make like another like Lux or Orianna type character for mid laners, which I think is a good character to make. It just turns out that Seraphine's kit was probably, kit and theme-wise, was probably just a bit too close to like what support players wanted compared to what mid players wanted.